Welcome, everyone. I'm very happy to welcome you to today's Abalin talk. I'm Marianne Methuen. I was asked to open the session in my capacity as president of the Linguistic Society of America, the LSA. I have to say, we of the LSA are very, very pleased to be able to participate in this amazing series of online lectures that are coming from all over the world that has been organized by Abalin under the direction of President Miguel Oliveira. What you guys have done is absolutely phenomenal in a time when all other communication could otherwise be put on hold, and here you're bringing the world this stunning series of lectures. It's absolutely wonderful. There have already been a number of LSA members in this series who've given their talks, but under the auspices of various other organizations. What Abalin has done, again, in pulling together linguistic societies from all over is just really phenomenal. In this particular portion of the series sponsored by the LSA, we'll be hearing from a number of linguists. Today we'll hear from Volya Kapatsinski. And then on the 1st of July, we'll hear from Ronita Quadros, Rachel Sutton-Spence, Erin Wilkinson, and Donna Jo Napoli on sign languages and linguistics. This will be a panel discussion. And then on the 11th, we'll hear from Ana Paula Brandão, Patty Epps, Susan Kuhn, Denny Moore, Zach O'Hagan, and Jorge Emilio Rosas Labrada. Another panel session on archiving and language documentation. Then on the 21st, Luca Champollion, Donkeys Under Discussion. And then finally, Tyler Kibbe on the 22nd, talk The Voice and Silence of Divinity, a socio-cognitive linguistic approach to religious violence. Let me just say that I think all of us linguists all over the world are very grateful to Abalin and to Miguel Oliveira for what you've done to bring us together. So today's talk will be by Volya Kapatsinski of the University of Oregon, and he will be introduced by José Ferrari.
Yeah. Hello, good evening for everyone. My name is José Ferrari Neto, and today I'm a professor and a researcher in the fields of linguistics and psycholinguistics in Federal University of Paraíba in Brazil. It's a pleasure for me to stay here tonight, and it's a great honor to listen to Professor Volya Kapatsinski. Is that correct, Professor? I'm sorry for my bad pronunciation of your name. It's a pleasure for me to stay here, as I said, and I would like to thank the opportunity to moderate this talk. It's a really great honor for me. So Professor Raquel Freitag and Professor Miguel Oliveira, I'm very, very grateful for the invitation for today. As you know, Linguistics Online is a promotion of ABRALIN, Brazilian Association of Linguistics, in cooperation with several international associations, among them the Permanent International Committee of Linguistics, the Latin American Association of Linguistics and Philology, the Argentinian Society of Linguistic Studies, the Spanish Society of Linguistics, the Linguistic Society of America, the Linguistics Association of Great Britain, the Australian Linguistic Society, and the British Association for Applied Linguistics. I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Volya Kapatsinski, who kindly accepted our invitation to give this talk. Dr. Kapatsinski is an associate professor and researcher at University of Oregon at the Department of Linguistics. His main research focuses on probabilistic, morphophonology, mental lexicon, statistical learning constituency, unitization, frequency effects, inferential statistics, and usage-based construction grammar. His talk today is entitled Associative Learning Mechanism in Language Acquisition. Before Professor Kapatsinski starts your presentation, I would like to ask to everyone who wants to make questions to Professor that do it using the online chat here in the Zoom meeting platform along the talk, so that the questions can be sending to Professor at the end of the presentation. It's okay for everyone? Good. Dr. Kapatsinski, from now on, you are my special guest, and I hope you can visit Brazil, specifically the Federal University of Paraíba. I have some research about language acquisition too, not based on statistical learning, but assuming a biological view of language. It would be a pleasure for me if you came to Brazil and make the joints of research about this theme. So I think you free to start your presentation, right? And from now on, the microphone is all yours. Thank you.
Thank you, José Ferrari. Wonderful introduction, and I'd love to visit Brazil, when this is all over. So I'm gonna share my screen. I have some slides prepared. I'm going to tell you a little bit about associative mechanisms in or for language acquisition today, and this is a lot of this is going to be based on my 2018 book, but a lot of it is also going to be newer work trying to improve upon associative mechanisms that have been proposed in the literature. So I work at the Department of Linguistics at the University of Oregon, which is shown here. This is our home, Straub Hall, and then top left here, you see our laboratory building, and then down at the bottom right, you see everybody else who's, and me also in the department. So, if you like what you're hearing, we would also love for you to come study with us at Oregon, or send us your good students as well. All right, so what do I mean by learning mechanisms? So there's a lot of research that has argued for the main general learning mechanisms recently in language acquisition and also in language processing. These are just a few of the references that one could list in the last 20 years. Still, a lot of work has also argued that associative learning is fundamentally limited in various ways, and so should be replaced by either domain-specific learning mechanisms developed maybe within linguistics or within other specific knowledge domains, or by Bayesian learning, which is another domain general candidate mechanism. I do not disagree that there are limitations to associative learning, but there's also some, I think, misconceptions about what associative learning can do. So today I'm going to say a little bit about both sort of the limitations of associative learning, the range of approaches to associative learning, and also the ways in which there are some limitations of, there are some apparent limitations of this approach that are not really inherent to the approach. So I'll tell you a little bit about what associative learning mechanisms are, and how we can use language data to shed light on learning mechanisms. So what I mean by a learning mechanism for the purposes of this research is a principle of belief updating. So if you believe a certain thing about the world and you experience something, then how do your beliefs change? What I don't mean by a learning mechanism is a module that does learning, either in the sense of a biological module or in the sense of a cognitive functional module. So I don't mean to try to persuade you that there is maybe one or more than one such mental module. So this contrasts with approaches such as this figure illustrated by Lids and Gagliardi in 2015, where you have this inference engine that takes in perceptual input and develops grammar based on those perceptual representations. Where the approach that I'm describing today differs from this kind of approach is primarily in that we're not looking for mechanisms in the sense of, well, how many, let's say, different inference engines there might be, right? So here, for example, this representation is telling us that there is the inference engine operates on perceptual intake, and there isn't, it seems, a learning system in production that is responsible for some aspects of grammar. You could argue against that, and I would argue against that to say that there is learning within production as well. And so in this kind of framework that Lids and Gagliardi are working in, you would say that there's another maybe inference engine within the production system. But what I'm after today is how these engines, however many of them there might be, would work internally. Right. So the focus on principles of belief updating kind of fits well with the fact that learning happens throughout the brain. So if you look at pretty much any synapses in the brain, they all change as a result of experience. And many areas of the brain learn according to the same principles. That makes it a little bit difficult to say, well, how many different inference engines or learning modules there might be. The whole brain is learning, and many areas of the brain are learning in the same ways. Not to say that they're all learning in the same ways, but to say that the same principles of updating these association weights or synaptic connection weights are actually shared by many brain areas. Also, this fits well with the idea that different organisms have very different brain architectures. They even have very different chemistry in terms of the neurotransmitters involved in synaptic changes. And yet, computationally, they all learn, and they all seem to implement the same learning mechanisms in the sense of what are they going to learn from a certain configuration of cues and contingencies between those cues and outcomes. From this perspective, learning mechanisms are distinct, not because they're in different areas of the brain, but because they make different predictions about what might be learned from a particular experience. And that is also, I think, a nice thing for us as linguists, because, as in our capacity as linguists, we are looking at, how linguistic knowledge and linguistic behavior develops as a result of experience, rather than, necessarily at how mental representations or activation patterns in the brain might change. So one way in which different learning mechanisms in the sense differ from each other is in the role that is attributed to prediction error in learning. The earliest models of associative learning were called Hebbian learning models after Donald Hebb, who is responsible for the slogan that neurons that fire together wire together. Somewhat less often mentioned part of this, of Hebb's theory, is also that those neurons that fire apart also come to, so to speak, wire apart or to inhibit each other as well. So Hebbian learning can implement sort of basic statistical learning where you can become sensitive to correlations between stimuli in the environment. So you can learn which particular events go together and which ones tend to occur without each other. But the defining characteristic of Hebbian learning, and one that has changed in models following Rescorla-Wagner's work in the 70s, is that learning rate is independent of surprise. So neurons, the strength of a connection between two events or two neurons increases at, when the two fire together in proportion to a certain learning rate, but not in proportion to how much of a surprise that co-occurrence was. In error-driven learning, on the other hand, surprise is crucial, and the goal of learning is really prediction. So the way that works is that when an event occurs unexpectedly in a certain context, then the features of that context become associated with the event. And conversely, when an event fails to occur in a context, and again, crucially, when it unexpectedly fails to occur, then you develop inhibitory associations from the features of that context to the event. So you start expecting that in these kinds of contexts, the event will not occur. And surprise in these models determines how much is learned. Now, there's evidence that both of these learning mechanisms actually coexist in the brain and are instantiated in different brain areas. There's also evidence that they work together in acquiring a lot of complex behavioral patterns like, let's say, language production. Today, I'm going to focus on the predictions of error-driven learning and testing those predictions with language data. So the research strategy that I've been pursuing in this work is to use kind of a baseline computational model of learning, and hopefully one that has extensive empirical support, because you wouldn't want to build on a foundation that doesn't have a lot of evidence behind it. We don't want to build on sand. And the model that I have started out with is the Rescorla-Wagner model, developed by Rescorla and Wagner in '72. It is extremely influential in animal learning to the extent that it's often called the standard theory of associative learning. And it was originally developed based on a lot of data from classical Pavlovian conditioning paradigms, often with non-human animals as well. However, it's also closely related to the Widrow-Hoff delta rule, which is probably the most widely used method for training artificial neural networks. So it's also something that not only is supported by a lot of data in animal learning, but it also has nice computational characteristics that have made it popular in training artificial neural networks. However, we also know that the Rescorla-Wagner model has important limitations. This theory is now 40 years old. And so the interesting cases to me are cases where it fails to learn something that humans do learn, or it learns in fundamentally different ways from the way that humans appear to learn. These are the cases where we have evidence that we need to change the model, right? And so they are cases where language learning data actually informs learning theory and the development of general learning mechanisms. When you have such a failure, then you can tweak the model, or if you cannot tweak it, then you might argue for adopting an entirely different model that is consistent with the data. But when in doubt, I take the approach of tweaking because given that we have a lot of support for this model from other domains, and given that it does have good computational characteristics in many ways, it seems like a drastic step to entirely abandon the model if we can make principled adjustments to it. And we'll see an example of such a principled adjustment later. So how does the Rescorla-Wagner model work? So when you have a queue, or more than one queue, co-occurring with one or more outcomes, you will update the associations from each of those queues to each of those outcomes. So these are present queues and present outcomes. For present outcomes, the idea is that their activations should be equal to 1 because they did occur on that trial. Their actual activations are the sum of the association weights from the queues present on that trial to that outcome. And the difference between the correct activation, which is 1 for a present outcome, and the actual activation of that outcome, which is determined by the association weights at that time, is the prediction error, right? So the present outcome should have activation 1. It has certain activation that's usually lower than 1. The difference is how much we will be increasing the weights from these queues to the outcome. This difference, the prediction error, is also multiplied by the learning rate, which in the full model is determined by how perceptually salient the outcome and the queues are. Here I'm abstracting away from it because I don't have, I'm not manipulating salience of the different queues and outcomes. When for outcomes that are absent on a certain trial, you update queues in the following queue outcome associations in the following way. And again, here you're updating just the associations from the queues that are present to these, in this case, absent outcomes. And these associations have to weaken in order to reflect the fact that the outcome did not occur on the trial in the presence of those queues. So the way these are updated is exactly the same. You're subtracting the activations of these outcomes from the correct activation, but the correct activation in this case is 0 rather than 1 because these are absent outcomes. So as a result of these updates, connections between present queues and present outcomes gradually strengthen, and those between present queues and absent outcomes weaken in proportion to prediction error. Nothing is learned about the associations of queues that are absent on a particular trial. So you're learning about the associations of the queues that you encounter, not ones that you do not encounter. That's one aspect of this model that has been criticized in the literature. So here's an example. If you have these two queues, Q1 and Q2, and these queues are associated with certain outcomes, then you're going to use these queues to make predictions about which of these outcomes will or will not occur. So here, Q1 and Q2 have positive associations with this outcome over here. And so basically you're expecting that 60% of the time when you encounter C1 and C2 together, you will see this outcome over here next. Whereas this other outcome down here is not associated with these Qs. So the sum of the Q weights here is 0. So you're not expecting this outcome to occur after Q1 and Q2. Right. So what if outcome 1 here does occur after you've perceived Q1 and Q2? Because it has occurred, its correct activation now is 1. Its actual activation was 0.6. So there is an error of 0.4 that is going to be used to update the association weights from Q1 and Q2 to outcome 1. Right? So there's error of 0.4, which is just 1 minus 0.6. For outcome 2, which did not occur, the correct activation is 0. The actual activation is also 0. And so there is no error that can be used to update these two associations, and their weights will stay the way that they were. Now, given a certain learning rate, let's say 0.2, we can now update these association weights, and we will be increasing these two association weights so that next time around, the learner is expecting outcome 1 to occur with a little bit more certainty when presented with this combination of Qs. So we updated it by multiplying the learning rate, 0.2, by the error, 0.4, which is shared between all of these Qs to the same outcome. So next time, there will be a bit more of an expectation that outcome 1 is going to occur after Q1 and Q2. Because prediction error is shared between all the Qs to a certain outcome, Qs end up competing for that prediction error. So this is because we are summing all of the Q outcome association weights here that share a particular outcome. So that if, for example, Q1 here had an association weight of 1 to outcome 1, there would be nothing for Q2 to do, right? Q2 would have an association weight necessarily of 0 with outcome 1. The Qs are competing for predicting outcome 1. And this basic property was the innovation by Rescorla and Wagner that differentiated their model from earlier models like Bush and Mosteler's 1951 model. This innovation also distinguishes it from a lot of statistical learning models where Qs do not really compete for predicting outcomes. The reason for this innovation by Rescorla and Wagner were Q competition effects. So these are empirical findings that have been observed in the animal learning literature. The main finding is the blocking effect developed by Kamen in '69, or discovered by Kamen in '69. And what he did was he trained, in his case, rabbits on a paradigm in which two Qs, A and B, predicted an outcome. In his case, this was a puff of air delivered to the rabbit's eyelid, which caused the rabbit to blink. And so there could be, let's say, tones or lights occurring before that puff of air that predict that there is going to be the puff of air and would cause the rabbit to prepare for that by closing its eyes early. So before training on a combination of Qs A and B predicting the outcome X, you could be trained either on A, one of these Qs predicting X, or on an unrelated Q, C, predicting X. Right? So it could be that you're trained on the light and the tone, predicting the puff of air. And before that, you saw that light and it was already predicting by itself the puff of air. Or it could be that before that, you had some other stimulus like, let's say, white noise predicting the puff of air. And what is found in this paradigm is that the associations between this new cue that's occurring in a compound with A, the cue B, are weaker if training on ABX was preceded by training on A by itself predicting X. Then after training on C predicting X. The Rescorla-Wagner explanation for this is that if you're trained on AB predicting X after training on A predicting X, then at the start of that training, there's very little error for B to account for. Because when you encounter A and B together, A is already leading you to expect X, so there's little error on ABX trials. So because AX already accounts for all the error that BX could have accounted for on ABX trials, there's nothing for B to do, and it doesn't end up being associated with X. So if you then present the learner with B alone, they're not going to anticipate X. Now, blocking is an interesting effect in part because it is not something that a rational learner would necessarily do, right? Because there is, in fact, a co-occurrence between B and X, right? And the occurrence of X is more likely if B has just occurred than if B hasn't just occurred. And so in principle, you should be learning that after B, you will get this puff of air if you are to kind of optimally prepare for these puffs of air coming. Right. So blocking is something that is quite informative about the nature of the learning mechanism, because you can imagine a lot of learning mechanisms that would not predict such an effect. Overshadowing is a related effect discovered already by Ivan Pavlov in 27, where training on AB, if you train, in his case, dogs on A and B, predicting a certain outcome, versus you train them on just A, predicting that same outcome, the association strength between A and X is going to be weaker if A occurred in combination with another cue. So B here is overshadowing, at least partially, A, preventing it from developing strong associations with the outcome. The inverse base, and again, the explanation for that through Rescorla-Wagner is the same, right? So A, when it occurs together with B, is going to be accounting for only half of the error, whereas A by itself is going to be accounting for all of the error. The inverse base rate effect is another example where in this paradigm, training on an outcome following a cue is interspersed with that outcome occurring without the cue. So, and what you find in this paradigm is that the learner's expectation of the outcome following the cue is weaker if they see that outcome a lot without the cue. So if the outcome has a high base rate. Now again, sort of doesn't seem like a rational thing for a learner to do, because you're increasing the prior probability of this outcome by increasing its base rate, and yet the learner is acting as if they're expecting it to occur less often following A. However, this receives the same explanation in the Rescorla-Wagner model as the blocking effect, because the idea is that even on the trials where there is no overt cue present, like tone or light, there's all sorts of aspects of the experimental situation that the learner can pick up on. You know, just the fact that they're in a certain room, they're interacting with a certain experiment, there's an experimental apparatus, and so on. And because there are always context cues, this is essentially the same setup as during the blocking effect. So on the not A trials, you get these context cues predicting the occurrence of the outcome. And these context cues then can block the experimental cues like A from predicting that outcome. All of these effects have been observed in language acquisition as well, more recently. So blocking effects, for example, have been observed by Arnon and Ramscar and Ellis and Sagara with learning for meaning mappings. So Arnon and Ramscar, for example, argue that in a lot of second language learning situations, you get nouns being presented to learners by themselves first. And then being presented in the context of a determiner. In such situations, they show that it is difficult to acquire the associations of determiners because the nouns, you know, basically block them from becoming associated with the meaning that is shared by the determiner-noun combination. Ellis and Sagara focus on verbal temporal morphology and temporal adverbs, where temporal adverbs seem to block or perhaps overshadow verbal morphology early on in second language acquisition. Nixon focuses on acoustic cues to phonological contrasts, so on. The inverse space rate effect has been shown with collocations, where associations between words that form a collocation are stronger if those words do not occur in other contexts. Today I'm going to tell you a little bit about how prediction error may also have sort of surprising effects on the structure of phonetic categories, where error-driven learning in the sense of Rescorla-Wagner might actually be leading phonetic categories to become more classical than they would otherwise be. This is joint work with my former graduate student, Paula Liarchuk, who's now an assistant professor at California State University, and Harald Baayen, who is one of the people primarily responsible for introducing Rescorla-Wagner to psycholinguistics. So what we did was we exposed English-speaking undergraduates at Oregon to a single novel phonetic category defined by a distribution. And different participants got different input distributions. After training, they rated the goodness of exemplars from the entire phonetic continuum that we showed them. And they also provided 3 typical productions that exemplified the category. The stimuli sounded kind of like this.
Ka, ka, ka.
And the particular phonetic category that we're examining here is the pitch excursion on these stimuli. So each of these stimuli has a pitch contour on it, and the pitch contour rises to a high tone from a low baseline. And the difference between the height of that high tone and the low tones at the edges is the phonetic continuum that we are examining. To make this kind of plausible for the learners, we told them that ka, I'm terrible at making these contours, means elbow in a language called Como, and so their task was basically to learn to say elbow in this language. Their exposure was basically just passive listening to 550 instances. You can imagine they hate us by the end of the 13 minutes that we torture them in this way. And each of them gets one of these two distributions, right? So these are all stimuli of ka with different pitch excursion magnitudes. Right? And some people get a lot of stimuli with pitch excursion magnitude of seven, I think 8 semitones, and others get a lot of stimuli with pitch excursion magnitude around 14 semitones. These curves here are basically showing you the histograms for how often people experience stimuli with each pitch excursion magnitude in each condition. Now, these conditions are matched for the mean pitch excursion, the median pitch excursion, and the standard deviation of these pitch excursions. Right. So the two categories that different people encounter are equally variable, and according to most, well, maybe a lot of models of categorization, they have the same centers. To match them on all of these characteristics, we had to skew them, right? So we had to make the distribution skewed in different directions. So the modes of these distributions clearly differ, right? So the mode of the red distribution is to the right of the blue distribution, has a higher pitch excursion magnitude. Now, how would these input distributions map onto category representations that people learn? And you know, we are assuming that those category representations are going to be reflected in productions and also in category goodness. If you look at the models in the literature on sound categorization, well, the classic models in that field are exemplar models and prototype models. Exemplar models basically store every token, right? And so your representation of the category is the pile of tokens, right, is kind of close to the histogram that I have just shown you. Maybe there's a bit of perceptual noise, and so it's going to be a little bit smooth in this way, but it's going to be closely following the contours of the original category. A prototype model, on the other hand, says that you represent the category by its center and some measure of variability around that center in each of the perceptual dimensions. In this case, the variability was equated. The categories had the same standard deviations. And so if you think that the center of the category is the mean or the median of that category, then these distributions should be represented exactly the same. So people who learn the red category and people who learn the blue category should all end up with a symmetrical distribution centered kind of in the middle between these categories. Now, if you think that they're centered on the modes, then you should see something like this, where you see symmetrical distributions for the blue category and the red category people, but the red one is to the right of the blue one. So what did we find? We found something that does not fit any of these models. And the reason for that is, we think, this questionable assumption of categorization models, that any token is equally influential on category representations. So a token is a token is a token. Yet, if you think of other domains of language learning, like word learning, you find that processing difficulty in word recognition or word production tracks log frequency of words and not raw frequency. And that suggested to us that really tokens of frequent words don't add as much as tokens of infrequent words, right? So the more rare a stimulus is, the lower its base rate, right? The more any given token of that stimulus is going to contribute to the association string. Now the minus log frequency is, of course, the information content of a stimulus or surprisal. And so tokens of frequent stimuli also from an information theoretic perspective contain less information than individual tokens of infrequent stimuli. So the results that we found were like this. So these are Likert scores, so goodness ratings for the different points on this continuum after training. And what you see is that the red distribution and the blue distribution people kind of have fairly symmetrical distributions, and the red distribution is to the left of the blue distribution. If we fit a polynomial curve to these learned category distributions, we find that a good fit is parabolic for both categories, and they basically just shifted left or right. But the interesting thing about these is that they're shifted in the opposite direction from the modes, right? So what you see here is that the red distribution mode in the input is to the right of the blue distribution mode, but in people's ratings, the mode of the ratings for the red distribution is to the left of the mode for the blue distribution. Right? So they kind of reversed each other. So they're not learning median or median or mean-based representations, because these curves are different from each other. They're also not learning mode-based representations in that the peaks of these distributions are actually away, on the opposite side from the mode compared to the mean. So what's going on here? Why are these things shifted? Well, one thing could be, of course, it's an experimental fluke. Maybe there's something weird about the ratings, but this is also reflected in the production results quite nicely. So people who were exposed to the blue distribution produce pitch excursions that are larger than people who were exposed to the red distribution. Right. And again, this aligns with these rating curves, but doesn't align with the modes of the original distributions. Individuals also behave quite consistently here, so it's not driven by a few outlying subjects. And reaction times in the rating task also align with the ratings themselves, right? So the blue people produce fastest responses somewhere over here, and the red people produce fastest responses somewhere over here. Both of them are fast near the typicality center and slow near the mode of the actual distribution. So why would that be? Well, so if you do think that tokens are not all equally weighted, and instead that tokens are weighted in proportion to their information content, then what that's going to do is it's going to lower these peaks, because they consist of a lot of what they consist of are relatively uninformative tokens, and it's not going to compress as much the side, the tails of these distributions. So relative to each other, the tails are going to raise and the peaks are going to go down. And if you do that, then you actually find this kind of shift. But that's not really a mechanistic account, right? So what are the participants actually doing? Why is it that you end up with this kind of log weighting? Mechanistic account that we proposed is using the Rescorla-Wagner model. We hypothesized that what subjects are doing here is they're trying to predict the next tone they're going to hear from the category ka or elbow, and also from the previous tone. So even though they're in a passive listening task, they're actually making predictions about what they're going to hear next. And of course they are, because they're just sitting there, and that's all they can do in a sense. They're just forced to listen to these tones. If you update the association weights between these cues, the previous tone and the category, and the outcome, which is the next tone, using the Rescorla-Wagner rule, you're going to find that the activations of the outcomes are, or of the tones, right, are going to reflect their log probability. And this is because the stimuli here are in random order, so there is no actual information about the next, the identity of the next tone, either in the category or in the previous tone. And so what you find here is if you do that, you find category representations that look kind of like this, where you see that the tails have become a lot higher relative to the peaks. And there's kind of an okay correlation between the activation of these tones in the model and how they are rated by the participants. So the results suggest that prediction error does matter, and that tokens of stimuli that you're not expecting as much based on your experience with the category are having an outsized influence on the category representation. Right? So if you encounter a token of an infrequent stimulus, that token shifts your category representation more than a token of a frequent stimulus would. If you do iterated learning with this mechanism, so you continue expose, so you assume that category goodness tracks log frequency, and production probability for these tones tracks category goodness. If you start out with a skewed category like this, you will eventually end up with a uniform category over the interval of tones that you've encountered plus perceptual noise. So eventually the within category distributions will actually evolve to be uniform. This is something that, of course, a lot of linguists believe, right? That actually within sound categories, they all belong to that category equally minus perceptual noise. It's a misperception at the edges. Now, I don't think it's entirely true. You know, it's literally true that the within category goodness distributions are completely uniform, but they're also not Zipfian, right? They're also not as peaky as you would expect from rich get richer loops in production. And so this suggests that maybe there's a pressure from this kind of error-driven learning process that's pushing sound categories towards being more like classical categories and less peaky than you would otherwise get them to be from the Zipfian pressure of a rich get richer loop, where the speaker, other things being equal, would keep producing the would keep targeting the category center based on the tendency to keep producing things that you have produced in the past. Right. So so this might be one error-driven learning might actually be making linguistic categories more classical and less speaking. Now, there are issues with the Rescorla-Wagner model, as I have mentioned, and one of these issues that I have recently been working on is called is something I call spurious excitement. I don't think people have called it that before. This is a prediction that Rescorla-Wagner made in their 72 paper, and it's a prediction that is weird and hasn't really been tested, at least in humans. There's one study with rats that has tested the prediction and has also not found support for it. So what's this prediction? The way this works is that if you have a queue that queues a certain outcome, so here A queues X by itself, but it does not queue that outcome in combination with either one of these two queues, B and C. Right, so A queues X, but A, B, or CA do not queue X, they queue Y. And then you give people trials on which there's another queue G that always occurs with Y and always occurs in the presence of C and B, which are themselves, as you can see, really strong predictors of Y and strong inhibitors of X. The prediction that the Rescorla-Wagner model makes is that D is actually going to be taken by the learner to be a queue to X and not to Y, even though it never co-occurs with X and it always co-occurs with Y. And in fact, D is expected to queue X more or as strongly as A does. Even though A co-occurs with X, right, by itself it's sufficient for X to occur, and D never co-occurs with X. So why is that? Rescorla-Wagner model has been shown by Danks 2003 to have equilibrium. Equilibria mean that if you give the model the same data set again, it will not change. It will end up with the same Q outcome weights that it started with. And there is an equilibrium for the Rescorla-Wagner model given these Q outcome contingencies that I can show here. Right, so the weight of the association from A to X at equilibrium can be is going to be +1, right? Because by itself, A should be activating X at the level of 1. It's the only Q here. But A together with B are always occurring in the absence of X, so the sum of their Q weights to X should be 0. And that means that the weight from B to X must be -1. Similarly, the weight from C to X must also be -1. That means that the weight from B to X plus the weight of C to X is -2. And yet, the sum of the weights from C, D, and B to X must be 0, right? Because X never occurs in the presence of these Qs. So ultimately, it should have activation of 0 in the presence of these 3 Qs. But B and C together are -2, right? That means that D to X must compensate for this -2 to bring the sum up to 0. And so its association with X must be +2. Right, this is a bizarre prediction intuitively, right, because D never actually co-occurs with X. No other model kind of suspiciously predicts this effect, right, because, and that kind of makes you wonder about the Rescorla-Wagner model. I mean, if in fact this prediction is true, then this would be strong confirmation of the Rescorla-Wagner model. But the fact that other models say that this should not happen suggests that maybe this prediction is not true. So if you think of a Hebbian model, which just wires together cues and outcomes that occur together, D, of course, will be a cue to Y, because D occurs with Y and it does not occur with X. And if you think of the other flavor of models that occur in this literature, which are configural or analogical models, and these are closely related to exemplar models in linguistics and categorization. These models say that instead of learning associations between these individual cues and outcomes, like Rescorla-Wagner does, what you do is you learn associations between configurations of cues, like CDB, and outcomes. And then you generalize to new cues by comparing them to known configurations. And so what you would do here is you would say, well, now that if you get QD by itself, which configuration from training is it most similar to? And clearly it's most similar to CDB, which was paired with Y, and so you should be responding with Y to D. Right. So both of these models predict that D should be a cue to Y, whereas Rescorla-Wagner predicts that it should be a cue to X. Now I implemented this Q outcome, this set of Q outcome contingencies in a little artificial language where A meant go left, and then B and C meant go right. And if you combined A with B or C with A, then it was right. So B and C would override A's instruction. Then CDB meant right. Now, because humans can count, and because if you actually instantiate this in a language, the Q configurations that consist of more than one Q are longer than ones that consist of only one Q. I was worried that people would pick up on that and use that as a cue to whether it's right or left. So I also added trials where a single Q, E or F meant left, trials where two Qs meant left, and where three Qs meant left as well. As well as cases where one Q meant right. Right. So these are basically just there to make sure that most people, and most people did do this, don't end up associating these outcomes with the length of the sentence instead. So what do we find? So we found that A, unsurprisingly, was a cue to X or left. But crucially, D was a cue to Y. It was not a cue to X. Right? So you see here, there's a gigantic difference between D and A. And people in this experiment were quite confident about what different cues and cue configurations meant. Right? So if you look at all of these cues overall, the response patterns are really close to 0 and 1. And similarly, if you look at learning curves over time, so these are the trials of the experiment, T means trial number, you find that people's overall accuracy kind of stabilizes around trial 200 and ends up being pretty stable after that. So this suggests that the learning is close to an equilibrium, and people are, in fact, people should be, people's behavior here should be fit by the Rescorla-Wagner model when it is also close to equilibrium. But it's not, right? It's this result contradicts the prediction of spurious excitement. Instead of taking D to be a cue to X, humans take it as a cue to Y, contrary to the Rescorla-Wagner model, and in accordance with Hebbian and configural or analogical alternatives. Now, does this mean that we should abandon the Rescorla-Wagner model? Maybe, right? If, in fact, this is also true of natural language learning, and if we cannot adjust the Rescorla-Wagner model in a principled way to avoid producing spurious excitement. Does this occur in real languages? Gabriela Caballero at UCSD and I applied the Rescorla-Wagner model to a language that Gabriela works on, which is Chogita-Raramuri. It's a Uto-Aztecan language. We tried to learn its morphology with Rescorla-Wagner. This is not as crazy as it sounds because Harald Baayen and colleagues have made great progress in learning morphologies of various languages with Rescorla-Wagner in a series of publications. Now, the interesting thing about Chogita-Raramuri is that there is a lot of multiple exponents in the language. So, for example, causative can be either a single re morph, or it could be rti or rt, where this is basically an allomorph of the same re suffix. And in either case, this just means causative. So speak causative means somebody made somebody else speak. And if you have the two causatives, it still means somebody made somebody else speak. Not well, it could also mean that somebody made somebody else make somebody else speak, but not in this case. So because there is a lot of multiple exponents, Rescorla-Wagner ends up being confused, and you end up with these sorts of situations where you have a Q that co-occurs with two strong inhibitors of a particular meaning. So in this case, you have stems that are fairly rare, and so they end up occurring only in the presence of, let's say, two causatives. Because they occur in the presence of the two causatives, the model then takes it as a strong exciter of other meanings that are inhibited by these causative morphemes, like applicative. So rare morphs that co-occur with multiple exponents of particular meaning then become the strongest cues to another meaning with which they do not actually co-occur. And this contradicts the intuitions of the speakers as well. Not only does it contradict the intuitions of the speakers, it's also the opposite of empirical effects that are well documented in the literature, like semantic prosody and pragmatic strengthening or semanticization. So words that tend to occur in particular semantic contexts, like in fact the word cause, which tends to occur in negative semantic contexts, end up having those sorts of negative associations instead of getting the associations that are the opposite of the words they co-occur with. So the task at hand then is to try to modify the Rescorla-Wagner model to prevent spurious excitement, because it is something that is problematic in the lab and is problematic for learning natural morphology as well, while retaining the importance of error for learning and retaining the good results of Rescorla-Wagner for Q competition. It turns out that this is actually quite easy. And all that needs to be done is to introduce a logistic activation function mediating between the sum of the weights and the activation of the outcome. This is what a logistic activation function looks like. The sum of the weights here varies between -infinity and +infinity, but the activation varies between 0 and 1, and it never quite reaches 0 and 1, right? So it only will get to 1 when the sum of the weights will get to +infinity, and it will only get to 0 when the sum of the weights is -infinity. What that does is it prevents the model from overshooting the activation limits. The problem that we had was that the sum of the weights from B and C to X overshot that lower limit on activation. The sum of these is -2, but the limit is 0. So d to x had to compensate for this overshoot and had to become +2, resulting in spurious excitement. Now, the simple solution here is to make these limits unreachable. Then you will never need to compensate for overshoot because there will never be overshoot. So this is just formally how the equations would change if you do that. So instead of subtracting the sum of the weights here, we put the sum of the weights down here into the denominator of the logistic. And so we end up with numbers between 0 and 1 here instead of numbers that are between minus and plus infinity. Does spurious excitement go away? So here's Rescorla-Wagner model trained on the same data as our participants, so exposed to those words and word sequences. And what you see here is spurious excitement emerging over the course of training. The dashed lines show equilibrium values. And what you see is that D gradually, over the course of training, becomes more and more of a Q to X rather than Q to Y. That's the wrong prediction. Now, introducing the logistic activation function completely changes the predictions here. D rapidly becomes not a Q to X and a Q to Y. And the model quickly settles on to thinking that given D, you should in fact be guessing that, that the outcome is X and not Y. So that's really nice. And not only does this do that, but it also has several side effects that retain the ability of the model to account for Q competition and also improve the account of Q competition. A common criticism of the Rescorla-Wagner model is that blocking, even though it occurs, it's often partial, and especially so in humans. If you train on A, B queuing X after A queuing X, you don't end up with people not learning at all that B is a Q to X. It just is a weaker Q to X than it would be if you trained on C to X before this training. And also, if you continue training them on A and B queuing X, they will eventually get it. They will eventually learn that B actually does Q to X, QX, and B eventually will catch up to A in the strength of its association with X. Azarlosa and Cicala have found this with animal learning, and Ellis and Zagarra also make the argument that this happens in second language acquisition as well. And at first, for example, temporal adverbs block the acquisition of verbal morphology, but eventually people catch on to the fact that verbal tense markers mean, let's say, past tense. These effects, the partiality of blocking and unblocking with repeated compound training, are not true in Rescorla-Wagner. So here I'm simulating an experiment using Rescorla-Wagner where at trial 11, you begin training on AX, and at trial 20, you begin training on ABX. What you see here is that A becomes associated with X, but B never actually becomes associated with X at all. With the logistic activation function, this is no longer true. A becomes associated with X, as you can see, even more rapidly. But after trial 20, when we start training on ABX, B also starts to become associated with X. There's still blocking in this model because, as you can see, the learning is a lot more rapid for A than it is for B. But this blocking is only partial. And this is because there's always some error in the logistic model on every trial, because you can the logistic function can never reach 0 and 1, and so there's always at least a little bit of error to account for. right? So there's always learning. Now, learning also always decelerates, right? There's diminishing returns from practice because you are approaching those 0 and 1 limits. You will never reach those limits, but at each point your change in probability becomes smaller and smaller. So this is what happens if you continue training on A, B, Q, and X. And in the dashed lines here, you see the logistic model weights. And in the solid lines here, you see the original Rescorla-Wagner model weights. Now, what you see with the Rescorla-Wagner is that there is a little bit of learning on B here, because when we start training on B, A has not accounted for all the error yet. But once B takes up that limited amount of error, there's no more learning, right? And it never catches up with A. Whereas in the logistic model, it does eventually catch up with A, at least on this probability scale, where these experiments are usually measured, because both of them are asymptotically approaching 1, right? And at each point, the rate of growth in A is going to, late in the learning, the rate of growth in A is going to be weaker than the rate of growth in B, because it's getting close to that upper limit. Now, another criticism of the associative learning generally is that it's slow, right? So this is very persistent in the literature. A lot of people have said this. And in Rescorla-Wagner, it's kind of true. Predictions depend on learning rate. And in order to avoid spurious excitement, in Rescorla-Wagner, you would have to make learning rate really, really slow. So if you look at these learning curves here, there is a short period early in training where D is actually a Q to Y. And this happens because at this point, the sum of the Q weights from C and B to X has not yet reached the limit, right? So if you make learning really slow so that that sum does not reach the limit and does not overshoot it, then you can extend this early period indefinitely and avoid spurious excitement, right? This would look like this, where by the end of training here, you still have really weak activation of Y here and really weak inhibition of X. Now, that would mean that learning is extremely slow. So in order to learn this mapping from X to Y and to get to equilibrium, from D to X and to get to equilibrium, to learn which Q's mean left and which ones mean right, you would need tens of thousands of trials. That is not plausible, right? Because word learning is really rapid, and because our subjects actually are quite confident about what the associations of these stimuli are by the end of training. And many have argued that word learning is too fast to be learned using such slow associative mechanisms. But if you change the activation function to be logistic, learning rate can be arbitrarily fast. So in fact, in our logistic model, the associations between D and X weaken within a couple trials, and the association from D to Y becomes close to ceiling in also just a few trials. And this was done intentionally by setting the learning rate for the logistic model really high. The point here is that you can set it to anything, and you will get with this, the same Q outcome associations in this model with these contingency structures. Right. So you can get one trial learning here of the association between D and Y. Now, a slightly different version of this argument was made by Gallistel and colleagues, who argued that associative learning models cannot explain rapid S-shaped S-shaped, right, logistic, learning curves. What they found was that if you disaggregate learning curves from classical conditioning experiments, where they were, up until that point, usually aggregated across animals, you find that the probability of responding to a certain cue, as if it's a cue to X, seems not to grow until a certain time and then shoots up rapidly. Learners differ primarily in when that shooting up occurs, but all of them show steep S-shaped curves. And Goldstone argued that this is not consistent with associative models where you have a constant sort of increase, a gradual constant increase in association weights over time. Instead, they suggested that you have that the animals have basically a moment of insight when they realize that B actually is a cue to X. Now, in the logistic model, we get these curves and we get these individual differences. So individual differences of this type can come from the strength of belief in the association between B and X prior to training. If X is a priori unlikely in the context of B, then learning will show the S-shaped function. And the reason it might be a priori unlikely is either because it's a novel outcome, like an electric shock in the classical conditioning experiments. There's no reason for an animal to be expecting an electric shock in any context. Or because there's a lot of possible outcomes, like in word learning experiments, where you have pretty much a near infinite number of possible concepts that could map onto a word. So if the outcome that occurs in the presence of B is a priori unlikely, according to the learner given B, then learning will be S-shaped. And the less likely it is to a particular learner, then the later the S-curve will occur, given the same learning rate. So this is what these differences look like. And so these are simulations, again, using the logistic model where there's training on an association between X and B throughout these 20 trials. And the weights, of course, increase continuously throughout, but the response probability or the activation shows a sudden S-curve. And the reason this S-curve is later than this curve is because this learner had a weaker prior belief than this learner. Right. So both of them have a learning rate of +2, but here the association from B to X started out at -6, and here it started out at -12. Right. The point here is that actually you can get these S-shaped learning curves. You can get them to be arbitrarily steep. So here you get from floor to ceiling in 3 trials. And you can get individuals to differ in when they display this S-shape in an associative model that learns continuously, and that's just continuously incrementing Q outcome association weights throughout. This is just a consequence of the nonlinear mapping from the sum of Q weights to activations in the logistic model. Finally, error in some experiments has been shown to seem to be different from the way that Rescorla-Wagner model treats it. So in Rescorla-Wagner, error is the difference between activation, between the sum of Q weights and the target activation. And if you train the Rescorla-Wagner model, this is something that we have shown in my lab last year on a Q that is randomly paired with 2 outcomes, X and Y, to a learner who thought this was a strong cue to X, and who also thought there are kind of weaker cues to X and Y, Rescorla-Wagner predicts that you should get downweighting of the A to X association. That should weaken. Kind of a sensible prediction, actually. And that this should be weaker, this downweighting of A to X should be lessened if there's other cues to X and Y. So if you're giving people a B queuing X and a C queuing Y, that should be less effective in weakening the association between A and X than just giving them A paired randomly with X and Y. And this is because a possible equilibrium after the second type of training retains the association between A and X at its maximum, 1, learns no association between B and X, and just learns a strong negative association between C and X. Right? So A plus B would then be 1, and A plus C would then be 0. Whereas if you have A randomly paired with X and Y, it should necessarily have equal weights to both X and Y. Now we showed that this prediction is incorrect, and that downweighting A to X occurs only if one can rely on something else, like B and C, to predict whether you'll get X or Y. We did this with VOT and F0 as cues to voicing. So for an English speaker, if VOT is 15, they tend to guess, and they hear something like bear, they tend to guess that this is bear. And if it's 35, they guess that this is pear. F0 at the beginning of the next vowel is a secondary cue that makes a big difference when VOT is kind of ambiguous. So at VOT 25, you can see that high F0 to 150 hertz is pear and low is bear. And if both are ambiguous, then you get uncertainty. You get pear bear. I love this picture. Now, what we wanted to do is we wanted to train the English speakers into Koreans who basically weight F0 more than VOT in making this distinction, so that, in fact, when VOT and F0 conflict, they would go with F0 instead of VOT, like here. And we had two conditions. In one condition, F0 values were informative. This is like the condition where B versus C cues the difference between X and Y. And we had another condition where F0 was always constant at 215, so there was no other cue to pay attention to in order to predict bear versus bear. And we found that people in this condition, when the constant F0 condition, learn nothing. They retain their really strong weights on VOT. They still responded as if VOT is the primary cue to voicing here, whereas people in this condition did learn to pay less attention to VOT and pay more attention to F0. Now, this is contrary to Rescorla-Wagner. We showed that with simulations. Why might this result be? Well, we argued that downweighting A to X associations in this constant F0 condition results in no improvement in error rate, right? So if you downweight VOT in this condition, you make the same number of wrong responses during training than if you don't, because there's nothing else to pay attention to. Right? You cannot rely on anything else to make correct responses. Whereas in this condition, if you downweight VOT, which is A here, you can rely on your B and C weights in order to make correct responses. Downweighting, therefore, happens only when it leads to increasing the number of correct responses. Now, in Rescorla-Wagner, you should still downweight here because your incorrect responses become less confident, and that reduces error in the sense of the difference between your expectation and the correct activation level. With a logistic function, we can in fact treat error categorically or quasi-categorically in this way, and basically have the model count how many correct or wrong responses it's making by making this activation function really steep. Right? So if you make it really shallow, this becomes close to the original Rescorla-Wagner model, except it never overshoots the limit, so it never gives you spurious excitement. If you make this mapping between the sum of weights and activation really steep, then basically sums of weights that predict the wrong outcome are wrong, and ones that predict the right outcome are right, no matter how close they are to 0 and 1. Or to plus and minus infinity in this case. So no matter how confidently they're predicting the outcomes they're predicting. So this is the one way in which the logistic model makes the Rescorla-Wagner model more flexible in terms of the number of different data patterns that it can account for. All right, so in conclusion, associative learning mechanisms differ when they make different predictions about what will be learned from a certain experience. We saw examples of this today with Hebbian learning, configural learning, Rescorla-Wagner, and Rescorla-Wagner with the logistic activation function. The Rescorla-Wagner model correctly predicts the importance of surprise or prediction error in learning. And it correctly predicts the existence of Q competition effects like blocking, overshadowing, and inverse base rate. Augmenting the model with a logistic activation function allows it to learn arbitrarily fast and to be able to treat the error either continuously or quasi-categorically. It allows it to capture apparent aha moments without actual aha moments, with just continuous updating of Q outcome association weights, and explains why learners continue learning about cues that were apparently blocked by other cues early in learning. These advantages are actually true for any learning domain in which the outcomes are nominal or categorical, which I would argue they are in language. Basically, the logistic activation function turns the Rescorla-Wagner model from something close to linear regression to something close to logistic regression. As a result of that, it makes it possible for that model to account for domains in which the outcomes are nominal, just like the logistic link function makes linear regression appropriate for nominal outcomes. Now, the way that it does that is by making sure that the activation limits towards which the model is striving are unreachable, right? So it will never, it will always be wrong. It will always not have reached its goal, its target activation level. So learning language seems to require setting impossible goals. Oops. Now, I would like to thank my former graduate students who contributed to this work, Zara Harman and Paula Ryarchuk, Harald Baayen, Kauri Demaro, and Gabriela Caballero also contributed to this work as collaborators on these various projects. Now, this sounds interesting. Again, we are looking for graduate students for the 2021-2022 year at this point. And so if you'd like to come study with us at the U of O, we are a good community, and we have excellent lab resources, and we really welcome more applications. All right, and thank you very much.
So, Dr. Kapatsinski, thank you for this brilliant talk. Let me start the question sessions. Okay. First, the first guy to make a question, it's me.
Well, that's your privilege to as the host, right?
Yeah, the only privilege. I'm this theoretical background is not familiar to me. So I apologize if my questions seems to be more primitive or basic one. So I was wondering if can keep calling this kind of data you talked about error, because since it seems to be more informative than the regular ones, and error can be a word very associated to not grammatical. So I mean, a grammatical, it's not produced by a speaker that work as a source of input to a children in language acquisition, early language acquisition stage. Mm-hmm. So do you agree with this statement? We can keep calling this kind of data error, or another name can be more precise one?
Yeah, I think there's a difference between prediction error, right? So these are errors that the learner is making in predicting what, like, let's say the caregiver will say, right? And like caregiver production error, right? So those are different, and I think need to be distinguished. I think we can learn from both types of error, right? So I didn't talk at all about reinforcement learning mechanisms today, but those sorts of mechanisms would be quite useful in trying to minimize error in production. And there's really nice work by Michael Goldstein and Werlaumont on the role of that in babbling. I think we have to distinguish between different types of error. I apologize if I said this is the only kind of if I called it just error, right? We should always, I think, say prediction error for this kind of error.
That's okay. Let me save another question raised by Márcia dos Santos Vieira. Could you talk about non-idealized categorization and slowly learning? Could you talk about non-idealized categorization and slowly learning? That's the question for you.
Okay. So non-idealized categorization and sorry, what was the second thing? The slow rate of
learning. Slowly learning.
Okay, slowly learning. Yeah, so these categories are fairly simple. Rescorla-Wagner does allow you to have basically any number of cues in your configuration. If in fact the category mappings are very noisy, you are going to get a long period of uncertainty in the model, even if the learning rate is fast, right? So even if we set learning rate to be fast, you are going to get actually a slow learning curve. If you have really noisy data, there may be advantages, to learning slowly, because you're going to get less interference. So you're going to get kind of less oscillation between kind of extreme beliefs if the model is learning slowly. the logistic function actually does help with these kinds of noisy noisy categories as well. So it doesn't have to be as slow as it would have to be with the original model, where if you overshoot the limits a lot, then you end up with basically not settling on any kind of sensible beliefs. Here, because you don't overshoot the limits, to the extent that the categories can be distinguished from each other, you will end up differentiating them, even with a fast learning rate. If there's nothing to differentiate between the categories, there is, I think, a principled limitation of this model, which is that it will never settle on a belief that the cues are meaningless, or that there's no way to distinguish between these categories. It will always keep trying to find meaning in the world, and just keep sort of jumping from one conclusion to the other. I think that is actually, it's not sort of what the rational learner would do, but that's maybe in some ways adaptive, in that, like, in the real world, we don't really get like completely meaningless cues. Usually there's some correlation with something. And so I'm not entirely, I don't know how much to worry about that particular limitation, that it cannot really settle on a belief that the cue is meaningless, or that it doesn't help discriminate between the categories, that there's nothing to discriminate between the categories. Now there are some results empirically that suggest that people start ignoring cues that are entirely meaningless, that, for example, are present on every trial in Ramscar, Baayen, Klein's 2013 study. And I think those sorts of things will need to be taken into, will need to be explained by basically learned inattention kinds of mechanisms, where cues that are entirely devoid of information will start being ignored by the attentional system. And that is not really in the Rescorla-Wagner model. That I think is a limitation of this model. It's not an in-principle limitation of associative models. So there's like work by McIntosh and Kruschke, for example, that does develop models that have learned selective attention, but it's not in this model.
Okay, another question still made by Marcia Vieira, and she is asking to you talk more about the relation between pragmatics, personal associative cues to meaning, selective attention, representation of multidimensional categories.
Yeah, so so social cues. I think so there's of course really convincing work by for example, Dare Baldwin here at Oregon, showing that social cues are really powerful, and that, for example, young learners may ignore words that maybe are spoken by, let's say, disembodied voices from loudspeakers as cues to meanings around them or objects around them. I think that it's exactly right that this is about selective attention, in that if we are hearing some speech that's not accompanied by, let's say, cues that indicate that the speech is actually addressed towards us, there is a rather low probability that that speech is actually referring to whatever it is we're currently looking at. Right. So unless there are these kinds of, I think, joint attention cues, I think it is not irrational for a learner to ignore those cues that are kind of unlikely to be informative here. So yeah, so those sorts of results often are taken to be an alternative to associative learning mechanism, but I think associative learning does actually expect that you should not be just wiring everything with everything, right? The cues that are unlikely to actually be informative are should not be wired with things. That's sort of the whole point of cue competition and selective attention.
The last one question raised by Natalia Vieira. Is there any method for teaching foreign language based on this model to non-specialist teachers?
So I would urge her to look at the work by Nick Ellis, who has exactly written a number of papers applying these kinds of principles to second language acquisition. They're very accessible also for non-specialists as well.
Is there time for one more question? Is my doubt, my question. To what extent this model, which is based on errors, can be used as a predictive model for human language acquisition? I mean, you mentioned some works which bring some evidence about matches between experimental data and language acquisition data. So what kind of evidence you have found it can be matched to data obtained by early language acquisition production data? So is there a match between experimental data and production data in early acquisition stages?
So like for example, the experiments on transitional probability learning that, often goes under statistical learning has a general term, right? So like Aslan, Safran, and Newport's work. I mean, transitional probabilities in that kind of design are perfectly compatible, or I mean, are what this kind of model would learn. In terms of word learning, there's work by Bob McMurray on early word learning, and also by Michael Ramscar, showing that a number of predictions of Rescorla-Wagner end up accounting for effects in those literatures. So things like exceptions to mutual exclusivity constraints in Ramscar, Daayen, Klein's paper, Ramscar, Daayen, Macaulay's work on past tense acquisition, right, also uses the Rescorla-Wagner model to account for why you might get U-shaped acquisition patterns. Now, there's other explanations for that, right? So I mean, I don't think it's by itself, it's sort of evidence for Rescorla-Wagner over other models, right? But it is not inconsistent with Rescorla-Wagner, what I would say.
Okay, again, Professor, thank you for your brilliant talk.
Thank you.
We also thank the audience. Also thanks to Raquel Freitag and Miguel Oliveira for inviting me to moderate this talk. And I hope you visit Brazil someday as my guest. I would like to highlight the importance of becoming an associate member of ABRALIN to strengthen our area and engage your community on this project. Finally, I'd like to invite you to keep on attending and promoting this project of Linguistics Online. Professor, thank you. Thank you, Professor Marianne. And I hope you see you soon here in Brazil, in Europe, in some university worldwide. And now we finish this talk. Okay.
Thank you very much. And it's been a great honor to be invited for this. It's a wonderful project, and yeah, great to contribute to it.
All right. The pleasure also mine and Brazilian linguistic community. Thank you, Professor. Bye-bye.